like to thank you all for braving the elements tonight and welcome you to the third reading in the series sponsored by the Friends of the Scranton Public Library, which this year is being called the Pennsylvania Tricentennial Poetry Series, all of the poets being from our state. This is the last reading for this fall, winter, and the next reading will be March 25th when C.K. Williams will be reading. Tonight we have Gerald Costanzo and Henry Braun. Gerald Costanzo will be reading first. He's on the faculty of the English department at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. He is the editor of the Carnegie Mellon University Press, which publishes many outstanding poets every year. He's been awarded a National Endowment Fellowship, published widely, has a book entitled In the Aviary, which will be on sale after the reading, published by the University of Missouri. And we are not going to be taking a break in between, but I would like to invite you now at the end of the reading to stay around for the wine and cheese and talking to the poets and whoever else. So I'd like to start now with Gerald Costanzo.
I'm always astonished when people go to poetry readings. I don't know why that is. Do you know that it's not considered to be too important in our culture? Did anyone tell you that? I've always had a soft spot for it. I went through a divorce a couple of years ago, and during that process, my poems were subpoenaed by the opposition. You don't believe me already. Ostensibly by the opposition to prove that I was an unstable person. And the judge, bless her heart, said it wasn't true. So I only lost 90% of everything I own. And certainly you can appreciate how I feel about poetry. This book is called In the Aviary, and it won the Devens Award in 1974 and was published by the University of Missouri Press at the beginning of 1975. I'm going to read a couple of poems from it. I've noticed that in a lot of readings I've been to lately and watched other poets read, they tend to read all their brand new poems and not some of the older poems that I like. So I'll read some of my older poems that I can still stand to look at. I guess those of you who are writers know how that is. The best things are always the most recent. This is a poem called The Bigamist. And it's just 2 sentences long. I was writing short poems in those days. No, it didn't have anything to do with the divorce. Just 2 sentences long. I happened to be listening to a newscast, and a lot of my poems are responses to things that are going on around me that I think maybe strike me as a little bizarre at first. It's kind of a means of stopping trivia, maybe, and looking at it. I hate to think of myself as a poet of trivia, but I think maybe that's it. I was listening to a Paul Harvey newscast, and he said a man named John Smith has a wife and 2 children and lives in Chicago, and a man named John Smith has a wife and 2 children and lives in St. Louis. And it turned out to be the same John Smith. And this had been going on for 11 years. And I began to think about what a perfect liar John would have to be. And maybe I could grow up to be like that. But I didn't have any sense of wanting to write a poem about it. And a couple of weeks later, I saw an article about a man in Utah who had 40 wives. And some militant feminists had gone into his office one day and shot him to death in protest. I guessed it was time for my bigamist poem. The Bigamist. He lives to learn the loopholes in his speech, the way the easy journey from Memphis to Mobile makes him forget 1/2 of everything. Darlings, as sure as there are 2 of you, there are 2 of him walking among us somewhere, disguised in his accustomed civilian clothes. This is a poem called Grasshoppers, and it simply happened on a day when I was looking for something to do and not being of much imagination, exhausted the possibilities and turned to TV Guide. There wasn't anything on till 11:30 that night on a show that we used to have in Pittsburgh called Chiller Theater with Chilly Billy Cardilli. You know, he wears a tux. And the movie was called Grasshoppers, and I used the statement about it from TV Guide as an epigraph. It said, "Atomic radiation gets the blame again as monster grasshoppers make a shambles of Illinois." And that seemed to me a show that I could really get interested in, so I waited all day, killing time, as they say, and then I fell asleep before it came on and woke up about 4 o'clock Sunday morning when there's really nothing to do, and this is poetry as therapy, I guess. Grasshoppers. Atomic radiation gets the blame again as monster grasshoppers make a shambles of Illinois. TV Guide. Suddenly they appeared, addicts for everything in Illinois. They removed Peoria in a minute, the populace drowning in a liquid with the sharp odor of tobacco juice. In Carbondale, grasshopper eyes were seen in the distance, luminous as astronauts' visors. Then came the end. Chicago's buildings were crushed in a holocaust of mandibles. They scuttled Skokie. Moline was a maelstrom as they moved toward the borders where, in the face of signs reading "Welcome to Indiana," Kentucky, Missouri, Iowa, and Wisconsin, they collapsed dying to their gargantuan knees. One of the things that I've been doing in the poems I've been writing lately, I've sort of half finished with 2 books, one of which is called The Lapse of the Bridesmaids. And it's a book that I think for me was a little too serious in tone, and so I have had trouble finishing it. Prior to that point in my life, I guess I hadn't been very serious about anything, and since then I've been much too serious, and it hasn't worked out very well. The book of poems I'm working on now is called Nobody Lives on Arthur Godfrey Boulevard, and these, I think it's not important that you know who Arthur Godfrey is. If you don't know who he is, think of a sort of Merv Griffin without any talent, who played the ukulele. Back in the early days of television, it didn't take very much to please us, I guess. At any rate, those poems all have American place names. I think of them as American poems in one way or another. And as I've looked back through these poems, it seems to me that, in a way, I was always interested in that sort of subject. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when I get to those. Anyway, this is one of those poems, and it's called Vigilantes. And I think was a poem I wrote during the Nixon administration, and wanting desperately not to write anything political. Found a sort of metaphor. I guess when I was young, I'm from Portland, Oregon, and ghost towns in Montana always fascinated me. And there were always stories of the vigilance committees. Vigilantes. There was a time in their country when they patrolled the streets of villages on horseback, lynching murderers and thieves at gatherings so formal they called them necktie parties. They wore sure, thin smiles as they yoked violence from shadows to the light. When law broke down in their towns, they bent over it and looked with pity deep into its giant eyes. They offered it smelling salts and soothed its wounds. They stroked it. They picked it up. They took it into their own hands. I'll read one more from In the Aviary. This is called When Guy Lombardo Died, and was a poem that I wrote way before Guy Lombardo died, not realizing he was going to go so soon. I think it's a poem about the end of traditions, how much we need certain kinds of traditions, and how I think about them maybe too often. The symbol, for example, the symbology of the new year being a new baby coming in and the old year as an old man with a long gray beard going out, had to have been created by someone who didn't really know very much about new babies coming in. It's not always that wonderful. When Guy Lombardo died, New Year's Eve went with him. On December 31st, all of the people on the earth's dark face forgot how to dance. Days later, when they remembered to foxtrot, there was no need. In the minute of midnight, gravity was suspended. The ball atop the Times Square building refused to descend. For the first time, rain swirled unimpeded by bodies to the pavement of those streets, the air a vacancy of kisses and noisemakers. In the morning, people came from their houses with no hangovers and stone sober proceeded with the old business of the world. And I want to read a couple of poems from this manuscript called The Lapse of the Bridesmaids. It's LAPS. I guess I wondered what happens to our laps when we stand up. It's like a whole part of the human anatomy just disappears. And this is a poem called The Old Neighborhood, which is dedicated to a friend of mine named Jerry Stern, whom you may have seen read right here, heard read right here. In a sense, this is a divorce poem. When I got divorced, I moved out of town so I could get away from it all. And it turned out that that 30-minute drive was just what I didn't need, a lot of time to feel sorry for myself. And this went on and on for a while, and I finally one time I noticed that off to the side of the road on my travels was a bowling alley. And one evening I decided to go in, and I found out that no matter how awful you feel, there's one place where you can go and feel superior to everyone. So I began going there every night. The Old Neighborhood. There was a time in my life when each evening after work, I'd go down and sit in the bowling alley. It was the only place I could feel superior then, watching the men in their leisure suits and the funny shoes, their fluffy honey wives and toreadors who always needed a few more pointers just to get it wrong again. I began to learn the strange power that comes of watching well. I knew the exhilaration in a mounting score for Flo's Boutique or Genuine Auto Parts. I wanted for myself these simple feats destined to be the life of the next beer blast. I began to want something funny to tell the guys down at some plant, instead of only the wondering at how things happen, at how people I loved and people I didn't crept up on me, even while I was paying attention, at how I'd come to be sitting night after night between the soda fountain and the scorers' benches, unwelcome in the old neighborhood once more. This is a poem called Jungles. And it's kind of an amalgam of my state of mind at the time and a series of letters that I came across. A lady I had met found these letters in her attic. They were courtship letters written to her great-grandmother in the 1800s. And they were rather fascinating. The salutation sort of told the story of the courtship. You know, it was, "Dear Miss Potts, dearest Viola, my darling Viola," and then back down to Viola. There were some terrific descriptions of the city of Pittsburgh in those days. The man had come from the deep suburbs and had become an accountant for a steel mill and had grown dissatisfied with that. The only time that he saw his lady was on weekends when he would go back out the Allegheny River to the town in which they lived, and he was the organist in the church, and they would get together then. He ended up leaving and going into the Midwest, into Illinois, where he became a school teacher, and we have the letters of the classic one-room schoolhouse where he's building the fire situation, and the letters going back and forth. He finally decides that what he really wants to do is be the head of the county mental hospital, and you can tell from the letters that she really wasn't for that at all, and he keeps trying to convince her that she'll never have to go anywhere near where he works and it'll be a comfortable life. Finally, he leaves Illinois and he goes to California, where he ends up with no money, and he pools what little resources he has with an ex-baker, and they make popcorn balls, which they have waifs selling on the streets of San Francisco. In his first letter, he tells her that California is surely the most sinful, awful place he's ever been. And a week later, he writes that California is clearly the most wonderful place on earth. So he was set straight fairly rapidly. He ends up back in Illinois, and they break the courtship off. At one point, he accuses her of not loving literature enough and doubting seriously that they could make a go of it. But I guess what was most stunning to me was that apparently there was a convention in those days that when a courtship broke down, everything was returned. And he had asked for her letters back many times and had not gotten them. And the last letter, in a very unusual and interesting penmanship, was the last sentence, which really gave me chills as I read it. Viola, you haven't returned my letters. Why should you keep them? And you know, well, I loved her for it. Jungles. If nothing between you and this world was right, you never said as much. One day, without leaving, you simply retreated to seek your fortune as if some California still existed, as if it were a state of mind. You learned the rootlessness within the body makes that journey difficult. Those letters to your loved one in Pennsylvania, from whichever remote village inside yourself you sent them, told her of nothing but your exquisite and declining penmanship. Years later, informed of your death, I think of all the time we spend probing the dark continents of ourselves, of what happens when a man at last, unshaven and ill-kempt, walks out of the jungles of his own heart, carrying not even so much as an answer. This is a short poem called Braille. The blind folding their dollar bills in half, giving the fives a crease on each corner, leaving the tens smooth as a knuckle. There are ways, even in trust among the rank and file of the seeing, not to be bilked. The blind leading the blind is not so bad. How it is lost on us every day that you can learn all of the world you need to know by tapping it gently with a stick. And some poems from Nobody Lives on Arthur Godfrey Boulevard. I've got two epigraphs to the book which I'd like to read, and I do this because they seem to me to say different things, and my feelings on this subject. And this is kind of a theme book, which is unusual for me because I hate them and don't publish them and can't understand why any poet would want to write one. And then I find myself in the midst of it. The first statement is from Thomas Hart Benton, and he wrote this in 1943. I love America. I love America so well that all its crudities and gross stupidities are no more to me than the little imperfections which give character and individuality to personal beauty. A windmill, a junk heap, and a Rotarian, in their American setting, have more meaning to me than Notre Dame, the Parthenon, or the heroes of the ages. I understand them. I get them emotionally. The stuff of this America, which I know directly and immediately, is to me more important actually and substantially than all the art of the past. And the second, just two sentences from Nathaniel West, The Day of the Locust. This was published in 1939. It is hard to laugh at the need for beauty and romance, no matter how tasteless, even horrible, the results of that need are. But it is easy to sigh. Few things are sadder than the truly monstrous. And the first poem I want to read from this group is called The Sacred Cows of Los Angeles. Had its beginning, really, I guess, when I was looking at a book of anthropology, and there was a large two-page picture of some cows kneeling in a road in India. Adjacent to the road was a swamp, and on the other side a lake, and lined up clear out of the picture were people waiting for the cows to get out of the way, which reminded me that there is indeed a literal meaning to sacred cows. Some people believe they are sacred. And I began to wonder, I guess, about the American sacred cow, and to be astounded that I live in a world where people would wait for cows to move. And I thought that perhaps someone in that picture, seeing me in a picture in a traffic jam, would think it was equally absurd. So I began to think I knew what American sacred cows were. I knew how much I loved my car. When gasoline prices rose, how I waited in those lines and paid, and it never occurred to me to put the thing away. And I tried to write the poem, and I couldn't make a go of it. And then one time, a couple weeks after I saw this picture, I was listening to the radio in the car, turned it on, and they were playing the history of rock and roll, which I guess everyone's heard. It's a documentary that goes on forever with Casey Kasem. Well, at any rate, he said, Casey said, right after this important message, we'll be back with an interview with the Beach Boys' mother. And I thought, my God, how lucky I am to be living here right now. And at any rate, she turned out to be crazy, and I loved her. He asked one of those long-winded questions that's just full of information that she already knows. How does it feel, Mrs. Wilson, to be the mother of sons who just a year ago were anonymous seniors at Hollywood High School right here in Hollywood, California, and who are now world famous and known as the Beach Boys? And she said, there never used to be any smog in Los Angeles. Los Angeles used to be a great place to live. You know, then they played Help Me Rhonda. That's got to be one of the shortest interviews ever. The sacred cows of Los Angeles. As if it had never happened, an old Angelino will remember the coming of the word smog, how in 1948 a meteorologist predicted the end of the past in 4 letters, how the sacred cows brought with them traffic lights and street signs, crosswalks, and the dotted line, which after a while they began to ignore. Pausing at corners, they'd drool a pool of oil and maybe etch a rubber patch, leaving. They were fed whatever it took. They were washed and shined. At night, they'd idle through La Cienega or watch from a lover's lane over the cool Pacific. They'd snooze beneath the flickering face of the Escondido drive-in or sleep in garages nestled in the waning fumes, safe a few hours from the future, safe from the sight of the full moon, a pomegranate resting on the hazy lip of Los Angeles. And this is called The Resurrection of Lake Erie. And I guess seemed to me indicative at the time of a kind of American way of handling problems. When things are really going bad and we don't know how to solve them, we declare them solved. Contrary to popular belief, there really hasn't been a resurrection of Lake Erie. It has an epigraph. Everything before me turns to allegory. Jose Emilio Pacheco, who's a poet whose work I really like, is a contemporary Mexican poet, writes lines like, the grim pronouncements of Texans and the lift that Wheaties give. That's why I like him. The resurrection of Lake Erie. Soon after the word went out, dismembered bodies cast off in barrels by the mafiosi fused, and hatching from those eggs of slat swam toward the shore of the new life. The rotting fish righted themselves and went on. Plant life again. And clear, warm breezes moved through Cleveland, Dunkirk, and Buffalo. In the air, geese, their honking and a pleasure in the sadness of natural life, its second chance. From the beaches, the waving arms of bathers signaled the freighters, signaled the sloop cutting across to Port Stanley. No, I can't read all the poems. I had to read the titles, though, right? This one's called The White Experience in America. This one's called Fear and Loathing in Neiman Marcus. And that brings us to Houdini disappearing in Philadelphia. Outside the theater in his best bib and tucker, we wondered where it was he went once he'd reappeared. Unlocked from that huge debris of chains or risen from a trunk bolted and submerged in a tank, wouldn't he need a cold beer? Wrists ringing with welts as he held aloft the police handcuffs, or loosed from a straitjacket night after night in 50 seconds flat, maybe he needed to escape. Most likely it was to a new woman one to whom he could finally and without fear confess it all. The man who could get out of anything. He disappeared into a cab and headed off up broad streets, well-lighted and imaginable breach. This one is Living the Good Life on the San Andreas Fault, and mentions Daly City, which is just south of San Francisco, right where the fault goes into the ocean. It mentions the Aleutians. My grandmother gave me a lifetime subscription to National Geographic, so I feel, at least it seems like a lifetime subscription. I feel obligated to read it. For those of us who are in the know, California is not going to break off into the sea. It's heading north and down. When the time comes, it's going to be underneath Alaska. Every day in Daly City is part of the beginning of the end. There at the tip where the great fault runs from Mexico to lose itself in the sea, they wait for the one morning when they will slide faster than they do now toward watery graves beneath the Aleutians. How the fiery night will extinguish itself where the earth opens to feed on its own tender crust. For 100 years, they will be the news that diminishes slowly to a simple lesson. There is just cause for misgiving. Not all our worry is needless. This is the price they pay for living the good life, the price for the freedom of extravagant loving, the food and the cars, for the abundance of mesmerization, the making it, and the overlooked, bountiful losing, for the guilt, the price they want to pay for living in the midst of an enchantment called America, which, like every fairy tale, needs its wicked witch. This is called Introduction of the Shopping Cart. And the shopping cart, probably you don't know, was invented in that bastion of American invention, Oklahoma City, in 1937. And the poem is really about a man who collects facts. So when a fact on one of his cards is mentioned, I'll just raise my hand. I never know quite how to do that. Introduction to the Shopping Cart, Oklahoma City, 1937. There was a man who collected facts. After work, he rode 20 stories, let himself into cartons filled with index cards and his crucial lists. Facts reveal useful lives. He got things right. The Shopping Cart, invented by Sylvan Goldman, Oklahoma City, 1937. When the man passed on, his relatives came. P.T. Barnum had 4 daughters. They searched through his cartons for $10 bills. The sky, which on cloudless days appears to be azure, has no true color. He wasn't eccentric. When they found nothing, they threw everything out. His final fact, you live and you die. The Shopping Cart, P.T. Barnum, The Sky. This is a poem called Jean Dixon's America. And like so many people, I get trapped in those supermarket lines with nothing to look at but the front of the National Enquirer and the Star. And usually about that time, I really do need to know what the folks on CHIPS are doing in their private lives. Last week, there was an article about Elvis Presley's girlfriend. I thought he'd been dead. You know, this guy's got amazing powers. Still has girlfriends. But for some reason, I picked up one of these. You know, Jean Dixon had something to say, and so I looked through it, and I became really fascinated by her diction, and you know, the phrases grave personal danger, consternation, and I just tried to put them together in a little prophecy, as Jean Dixon might have it. San Francisco remains in grave personal danger. Dubuque continues to be a source of consternation for the entire Hawkeye state. Tensions could diminish, though, only through an act of subterfuge. New Jersey will be named in a paternity suit, but will wage battle in open court to preserve its good name. Look for Minneapolis and St. Paul to split, this time for good. Each will agree they were never meant to be together. New York City will embark on a religious pilgrimage either to Rome or Jerusalem, but there can be no forgiveness. Overnight stardom is putting a great deal of pressure on Missoula, Montana, which will have to choose its roles carefully in the coming months or risk being a ghost town by the end of the decade. Peoria must keep itself from overexposure once again this year. If it succeeds, its many problems will continue to go unnoticed. Honolulu, weary of the long commute, longs to be part of the mainland, especially of Southern California. But with things the way they are now, don't look for this to happen anytime soon. Let's see, I think I'll just read a couple more and then finish with one from In the Aviary. I have to read Nobody Lives on Arthur Godfrey Boulevard. Nobody lives on Arthur Godfrey Boulevard. When I first heard about America, it was already too late. When I learned that its holiest city is Dallas, Texas, there was nothing I could do but bear witness to the deckled edge of manifest destiny, California well on its way to becoming an island, or some foreign country where one of the many forms of English is still spoken. I had missed the arduous construction of democracy, though I lived among its numbered days. What I saw was the reconstruction of Fifth Avenue and the Army Corps of Engineers dredging sand from the sea and piling it back where the beaches belong. I heard wry assemblages of Rotarians, Shriners, and Optimists, Elks and Moose, committing business over lunch. I listened as my friends wondered at the poverty which affluence breeds, not quite believing in the life lived on Frank Sinatra Drive, nor in the one where nobody lives on Arthur Godfrey Boulevard. I watched brotherhood practiced among corporations and freedom in the emporiums of fast food, the separation of church and religion. I saw all of us becoming stranded everywhere in our land. The new pilgrims arrived at last on the shore of a great desert, mouthing our own sad psalms. This is called The Man Who Invented Las Vegas. In church, he never felt the weight of God, which hangs in those places heavier than any mist. He only felt the overwhelming presence of luck. When he knelt, his bones cracked like loaded dice and fell into place. The choirs he heard were of roulette wheels spinning in rooms, velvet and vacant of light as an altar without candles. He saw middle-aged housewives grown tired of marriages more sour than lemons, standing in rows, pulling the levers of slot machines again and again, often not seeing the final combinations of their unexotic fruit. The fascinations of boredom and chance. He gathered electricity and with its flashes and spurts and steady rays, turned darkness out of the desert forever, thinking, we shall never sleep. He witnessed the spectacle from a distance and in the trance of a child staring into his first fire, learning the beauty and heat of its rage. And he thought not that it was good or bad, but that what he had made was a thing some of the people who live on earth for a while could believe in. And I want to finish with a short poem at the end of In the Aviary. This is called The Meeting. Somewhere along the road, you meet up with yourself. Recognition is immediate. If it happens at the proper time and place, you propose a toast. May you remain as my shadow when I lie down. May I live on as your ghost. Then you pass, knowing you'll never see yourself that way again. The fires which burn before you are your penance. The ashes you leave behind are your name. Thank you very much. Thanks. You going to help me?
Detach you.
Yes, thank you.
Our second reader this evening is Henry Braun. He teaches in the English department at Temple University in Philadelphia, but he's currently poet in residence at Wilkes College in Wilkes-Barre. He has had a Fulbright scholarship to study in France. His poems have appeared in numerous publications, and his book, entitled The Virgil Woods, has been published by Athenaeum Press. Henry Braun.
Well, I'm going to start off by reading some poems from the old book, The Virgil Woods, then I'll read some newer ones. I'll start with a poem about fanaticism, the kind of ultimate commitment that people are into who know everything about the Civil War, for instance. The people that sit in libraries all the time with shining eyes. It's called The Scholar. I am alone with my fish in the fishbowl, getting used to fins, unused to fingers. Through naked stretches of the bowl we swim beyond the schools. The noises of school life come clinking across the watercolored pail. I, toward my great fact turning, ignore. Oh, gray and immense, his scales hang like a wall of shutters breathing to the water's lung. A ray of sunlight flips him into glory. I swim freestyle, unnoticeably small, and butt very gently on that flank. Have I stopped for long? Many hours are lonely, the wrinkles on my fingers near the bone. Yet when the light from him pours through my eyes, a rainbow spans my dark interior, and I linger. Some days we browse in quietness, some, subspicia eternitatis, paddle on. This poem is fallout from disaster in graduate school. I had a teacher who didn't like me and whom I respected idiotically. No, I respected reasonably because a very solid man, but it wasn't a back and forth affection. And later I saw him after I was thrown out of graduate school in the park, and we had nothing much to say to each other, and I immediately wrote this poem on a park bench afterwards. For an old teacher. So unhappily magnified to me, this man who sees me as small as I see him large, both looking through the same telescope at different ends. Others disparage him to me, some tear him down, a few perhaps praise me to him. But when at rare times we meet, inescapably on the lonely sidewalk, and cannot talk, we edge around each other like game birds of different species. And because that is so, the instrument will not come down for life, but holds to the same sharp-focused ratio our blindness towards each other. Well, I had a life subscription to life. And life died and it's been resurrected. But when I had it once, there was a picture of an animal being killed, a gnu, and then I lost the copy and I lost the subscription, and the magazine lost itself. And sort of years later, I remembered that animal being killed by a big cat, and I wrote this poem. And I knew it was called a gnu, but I didn't know where gnus were or from or what kinds of cats killed them. I just know the moment. Really more the expression on the face of this young gnu. GNU. GNU, new. So what they call it, the critics, us critics, the effective fallacy or something. I tried to imagine what the new was thinking. The day I was eaten began warmly under mother, as usual. They called me a fool to go from there to breakfast unafraid. My way's my way. It was a decent calfhood, the sleeping and eating part. Before I had a chance at sex with news, a tiger deflowered me by the throat. Well, that's life, and this is afterlife in the head of a man who's playing with my name. He has to look me up in a book, of course, to see if tigers really do it to news. I can't complain. A little pleasure, a little fear, one big event, and then to have done with it. In my will is my peace. Originally, the line was no news is good news, but I didn't think I'd get away with it. Not with the first book. This is a timeless poem, the next one. I'm going to read it at a conference I'm going to be part of Saturday called Starving in Philadelphia. It's about trickle-down economics. I wrote it 10 years ago, but it's from like the news, only it's from the point of view of the masters. It's imagining what it must be like to trickle things down. This is called crumb giving. Only from our point of view as masters of the table does the eater of crumbs glow with a terrible loveliness. He clings to our pity like a bat. Certainly, and a few, independent of the prince, think that disgusting. Our table, his rafter. They miss the light in his face when we bowl him the crumb. For a moment, he sees it with the fullest glance, a baby's, his crumb without compare. There is nothing else in the world but its hollows, its rims bounding dreamily over the tablecloth like sagebrush. From a distance, he drinks the shadows in, facet by facet, and swells. What a pleasure to hear us, the masters, counting 2, 3, until, lovingly, it's his. This is another, I suppose, political poem. I wrote it a while ago during the Vietnam War. It was during the early part, during the time when to sort of feel there was something wrong with the war, if you read the newspapers, was to sort of feel that not like you were alone with your small circle of friends. It was during what President Johnson called the consensus of everybody agreeing on one side, sort of. And I remember just sitting down, and I was also taking a biology course then, and thinking it was like being a germ in a petri dish or something, that the consensus of sunlight would kill you. I mean, anyway, I got this kind of complicated image, and it's called These Days. It's sort of kind of half dedicated to Senator Fulbright, who at that time seemed to be alone in the Senate in questioning things. These days the sunlight almost seems total. A few men, trees, stand between heaven and earth. In the light of their shadows, we others are reading still messages the dead have stopped sending, these days of almost fatal sunlight. Well, when I was 12, I wrestled. And I used to wrestle as a kind of victim. I'd go to school every day, and I'd have to meet Bert Gladstone, who would always beat me up if I didn't meet him to wrestle. And I did it religiously. And this is the poem that came out of meeting him 20 years later, finding that I knew what we were both thinking about, and we had nothing much to talk about, except the weather. But, well, here's the poem. It's called The Wrestlers. Yesterday, after 20 years, schools, businesses, and wars, I met my wrestling partner, Bert B. He was the boy who taught the Nelson half and full to the grammar school. But Bert was no fool. He kept tricks in his bag. I tried, and when Uncle was cried for, I cried. Holding out longer, girls were there. He is a bull now, I am a bear. Neither wants to talk for long. But yesterday, in a glance, it seemed our little lost bodies sprang towards sweat and the mat again. Finally, from the Virgil Woods is, got to read it because I just had another crown, too. It's a poem called My Crowns. It's about some crowns I had made at the Harvard Dental School. I recommend it. Apprentice dentist gave some crowns from a tooth that I'd lost when I was a kid. At the time, that's what you did. You pulled them then, and it was very bad, you know, and so I needed crowns. And I went to the Harvard Dental School, had no money, and I had an apprentice dentist who for months I went for every Monday afternoon, and he made crowns. And later I met him and I couldn't talk to him on the street either. These are poems about kind of strange alienation. You know, ex-dentist, even though I'd spent, no, my ex-dentist, he's still a dentist probably now. It's dedicated to him, but I make up his name. I call him Dr. Pontifex, which is bridge maker in Latin. Pons facere, to make a bridge from one world to the next. And it's a poem that contains everything. All literature, all knowledge, everything. It's one of these ambitious poems, full of references to Shakespeare and Baudelaire. But it's about how I got my teeth fixed, too. All at once. It's called My Crowns. Urban decay. My crowns. That was wings, too. Like everything not rigid. Everything between two people, or a people and its city, or a cloud and its sky. The dentist and I worked my teeth for half a year, the new Boston rising from its pad outside our window. And as he drilled deeper, the development reached higher, and I grew older, until all was capped with gold. His fee, the sky, the stumps that lined my jaw, that aching row. I am complete now, though the city is still changing. I miss the man whose intelligence lay wholly in his competence, all clouded beside. Such friendships end when the skill that called them up has run its course. Everything human has wings, better to name it that than decay, and flies toward an inevitable future. A city, a body, warmth between two men, everything has its day, except, of course, my golden crowns. Well, the new book is called The Shed. This is part of it, and the title poem I'd like to read. There are a lot of poems about a farm in Maine, which I go to in summers. I spent a couple of years there, actually, just right through the winter, too, with wood stoves and no systems, nothing to break down, except everything to break down. I mean, the roof and all that, but nothing which you have to call anybody from outside. And this is a description of a shed that's practically part of the landscape. It hasn't been painted in a long time, and although I've re-roofed it, it fits there as much as the woods and the trees behind it. It seems to. And it's a poem about going back and forth between the city and Maine, between Philadelphia and Maine, about being split. Shed. An old silvery shed puzzles me with longing, and I free myself by carefully slipping the reins from my shoulders to follow. But where? How can I move and keep the shed in view? Easy metaphor might close the road like a forbidding angel. I need much more. I need an art to live in henceforth as a life, though I know it's true that good insights radiate the day around them joyfully. One or two likenesses in tension together, a piecemeal heaven, a country shed gleaming for friends in the city through my words, maybe that's all I can have. And thanks for that too. But some men have pulled a heaven permanently down about our eyes and staked it like a great, painfully beautiful circus tent. Contemporaries have taken that for the sky it is, our human nature's sky. So, I start as usual on my home ground, a chair, and a long, soft look over the daily environment of known things in fresh light, and address myself to the problem of the shed and the gift of it, not knowing if this is travel, sitting quite still, or both at once. Another poem at the farm. It's a poem about how hard it is for me to write and the writing. I'm always getting easily distracted. It's about my daily habits. This is getting over habits, which you really don't get over. You got to take them inside and make them work for you. My nearest habit is waiting in the kitchen as a blind date with the food I meet there, and over I go to set my hands to what my heart's already set on. Then a quick limb fling down to Heraclitus Brook to see. Then a quick limb fling down to Heraclitus Brook to see how the waters differ from the last time, and back up toward the white page, stopping short for a chance spillover from all the habits, though usually not for long enough. The next hump is drawing me with its load, and I journey on to a good read, a schmooze, or a sleep, habit by habit across the hour's delectable old hills. Schmooze is Yiddish for small talk. Good read, as a noun. To have a good read, like to read a cereal box when you're a kid, that's a sort of thing. You're writing and then, hey, here's a cereal box. And that kind of distraction. This poem is called Weight, W-E-I-G-H-T. We are given weight, separate from the earth as the first miracle, a certain leave to rise like the stones in a thawing road. There are directions pointed to by growing in the flowering branch, or the equal root for those who have tried and tired, who disbelieve the sunlight. Because it is lonely, teachers wait at the mouths of caves for our coming home. This poem started off from those pictures in biographies of great men and women of their classmates. There's one of Ezra Pound, who grew up outside of Philadelphia in Wincott, and shows Pound, but he's just one of a whole bunch of kids at the military academy in Wincott. Which one's the great man, like pick the flaws in the house or pick the greatness? I remember reading a biography of Robert Frost, and it was a photograph of Jeannie Frost, and her face was quite as sensitive as his, and Thoreau's sister was as deep as looking as he. What happened to all of those people? Sometimes we know, like Frost's sister had a miserable life. Chekhov's brothers, several of them, had miserable lives. Well, just the relationship of that great person and all these others. Are they there to be helpers and servers, as Ibsen once said, that all the rest of the people in the country exist to be the helpers and servers of the geniuses, that come out. This is about that. It's called Old Groups. We are the underground of the tears of things in rotogravure, where Chekhov's brothers are watching, and a girl, Robert Frost, the other side of words. Not a face is saying, I'm only a relative of greatness in row 2. Each fills up his space in separate life, meals and the weather, a try at coherence. Helping and serving is part-time, if at all. Life is so heavy in the old groups that profits are without honor. What they have to go on is love and a grudged okay, the good that is always coming out of Nazareth. Farmhouse has no systems, but it's got oil lamps, and this is about reading those big novels, like Roderick Random, and there's some of these novels that have about 800, 900 pages, and the lamps go on and on, my family's sleeping, and reading late tries to get at this. Some evenings, fragility lays itself out on roads from the novel you are reading, old, peculiar enlargements that keep you wakeful long after the book closes. Someone was alive whom you followed by oil lamp for hours through the pages, and now, in a quiet house, everyone breathing must be looked at, and more than looked at, accompanied. And sometimes when it's time to go back to school, although I love teaching, especially when I have a class as fine as the one at Wilkes recently, or some of those I've had at Temple, I don't want to leave the farm. And I just look at an ox or a horse in the next field and say, gee, I wish I could sort of stay around and eat grass. Okay, this is ox, from the point of view of the ox. I marvel at the rope that holds me, how it drops into its own thickness, and the yoke, too, plant that rides me with hard thighs. Landing on me now is the first snow, the rain that takes time. What season, I ask? Have to think, have to begin to pull on the syllables of winter. For me, a field with a horse is like a sentence with helpful punctuation. Growing lettuce. I have broken soil and run a line in the blackness with my forefinger and dropped the flea-like seeds in too thickly. Even so, the lettuce came, standing room only, as a favor to a first try, and was a shy green. I am ashamed to be so old coming to harvest. Once passing by our farm, there were some friends who were going to the big mountains out in the west, and they were going to climb with ropes and stuff. And but they left their catalog of mountain tools at the farm. We have little mountains there, and I don't climb anything I can't do ropelessly. And this is an excursion among mountain tools. Just looking through the catalog, I like their names. The Chouinard Chrome Mali Piton and the Dolt Cobra, who would not take them and go on up to make a lovely killing of himself on a rock face? I, for one, so far, and most of my friends. Would belaying gloves lengthen my adventure? And the cliffhanger, that highly desirable tool for the extreme artificial climb? I trust they would. They are so beautiful in this catalog. I want them already to handle nicely and show on a flat table. But I hear my old tools sighing, betrayer, have you forgotten your song on the formal beauty of the crowbar? 10 pries from 6 directions, or the peasant handiness of the pliers? Stop whoring after strange gauds. I am pierced before I start my climb, a figure of linguistic fun who would pinprick the cliffs of fall with his Griville, his Krampus, his Dream, and his Stubai Nanga Parbat. This is a poem, I guess, about writing, living, or whatever, but it doesn't need any words. It's called The Thief of Permission. I mean, sometimes you feel you don't quite have permission to just kind of like do something. Like even cross the street or dare to eat a peach, as a great poet once said. You know, that kind of state. A thief lives on the side where my eyes were. I glance back and forth with my day vision and my night vision and eat carrots, but he gets around me. Were my head all eye, a ball that tells all the present to itself, then I would find this thief, deny him what he takes, my sense of permission to live freely and make freely. But my eyes are slow slits that close half the time to rest their blindness for the other half. Sometimes, though, all a prong I act as if the thief permitted, going very far out, laughing, giddy, serious, until the permit's stealthily withdrawn. Stage door pop. Maybe you've seen these television commercials where there's the doorkeeper at a theater, all these beautiful young women running around, ballet and all that behind him towards the stage, and he's there. He's kind of old man. He listens to the radio, and he wears a sweater. And I was writing about him as the keeper of tradition, and a symbol for everything: English literature, Shakespeare, Plato, my father, the whole bit. But well, the poem says it, I think. Stage door pop. Slow moving here, I am athletic in the dream world. whose cavern widens out from a man. I meet him at the door, off a dark alley the artists use on their solitary way to the footlights, a gray-haired guardian in a sweater whom everyone calls Pop. Resting or walking at the city's heart, he listens to the game on his radio and gathers in his arms the roses for the virtuosi. Over the years he'll tell and tell again what only he saw playing in glory at the old premieres. With Pop, I reason all things out slowly, and then I leap from the wings. This is a poem called Had Gadya. It means little goat. On Passover in Jewish families, there's a song that's sung about a little goat that's connected to a little stick, and it's a whole, like the house that Jack built, it has a whole connection all the way up to God. It's an explanation of the world using single examples all connected with each other from life. Had Gadya, one little goat to test his forefoot, and one little lamb whose outline so swallows in her caricature that she is what she is, and no laughing. I almost want to explain that. I had a little lamb and fed it with a milk bottle. They slammed the milk bottles. Tremendous verb, lambs. Had Gadya, one little goat to test his forefoot, and one little lamb whose outline so swallows in his caricature, her caricature, that she is what she is, and no laughing. Had Gadya, what science is this? One rat and one maze, pleasure and pain, the repetitions of the single one? Had Gadya, one star, one bone to find your poor dog with, to think out the mastodon? Had Gadya, one group, for a short time in uncontrolled conditions, one iron age, one city, one marriage, one consciousness in which the Father someday may rejoice. Had Gadya. This is my liberation poem, I guess, women's liberation poem. I mean, finding out what it means. But I'm not sure still what it means, what the poem means. But and the way it started, I was just teaching at school. A young woman walked by and she tripped. I didn't know her, and I never saw her afterwards. She kind of tripped and spilled her tray. But you know, it made me question myself. It's mysterious to me. I don't know if it's mysterious in itself. The stumble. And I guess it's addressed to myself. That's maybe who I started with I, and then I changed it to you, and here's the way it goes. You are walking straight and well toward your vanishing point down a cleared, long road. From the far tip of its V, trees on film strips of trees ratchet along past your temples,